much. Oh yeah. Thank you so much. Before we're starting the initial presentation, I just want to ask participants to please go to www.menti.com and answer some questions for us. We just want to adapt this workshop a bit to where you're at. So we want to know, why did you choose to join this workshop and what currently bothers you about your curriculum? So we'll just take a minute. You just go to www.menti.com. You use the code that is on my screen. Like everyone should be able to see. It will also be posted in the chat. And we are going to come back to this a little bit later during the workshop. The first one that is going to present in our group is Devika. So I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Alex. Thanks a lot, Jera. Sorry, it's really early in the morning where I am, so my voice is like not really awake yet. So yeah, please bear with me as I croak through this. So should I start sharing my screen? Alex, is that okay? So the code is in the chat, so you guys can take a look over there. Okay. So just to, okay, I'm gonna. Right. Can you see my screen? Can you see my slides? Okay, beautiful. All right, so thanks so much for being here. Thanks so much for giving us the opportunity to talk to you about like what we've been doing at D-Econ, and of course, like it's going to be far more interactive after I stop speaking. So all of us are part of Diversifying and Decolonizing Economics. That's the common thread. You can see we come from all different places, at least come from, affiliated to, and are based in different places. But I guess like what brought us together and the purpose of, and this will have relevance to our discussions later about curriculum, is that a lot of, and part of the reason why, the reason why we started economics as D-Econ was because we were troubled with several types of things within the economics discipline. Among them, the lack of diversity. And when I say diversity, as Jaya pointed out, I mean, in terms of like identity, that basically who are economists, who do we read as economists, who we consider economists and take seriously as economists. And sort of that's the second one here, that mostly like white Western men still dominate economics in whatever branch of the discipline you look at. But more importantly, there's also a lack of diversity in terms of the theoretical approaches that we consider economics and worthwhile teaching and learning. And so these are the two types of like lack of diversity that we see in economics. But in addition to that, there's also like, and these are all like interrelated things, so sometimes it's not very clear to draw like a hard distinction. However, in addition to this, like both heterodox and mainstream economics are plagued by historically produced Eurocentrism, not only in content but also in our practices within the discipline. And sort of that was kind of the mess of interrelated issues because of which we started D-Econ now 2.5 years ago. And so it's straight off the bat, it's very important for me to point out that when we say decolonizing economics, we're not really talking about diversity. And I guess like we made this little schematic, just kind of highlight the different issues. And the way we see it is that like when we think of decolonizing economics, it involves a lot of things. Part of it is, yes, increasing the diversity within the discipline in terms of like theoretical approaches, people who practice it, etc., is a part of the question. And it's not that it's not important, but in addition to that, it requires like addressing structural exclusion in the discipline and addressing universalism in economic theory. And so within sort of increasing diversity, it's about like not only increasing the diversity of the identity of people in the discipline, but also talking about theoretical and methodological pluralism. In today's day and age, you can see there's a lot of talk about, like increasing diversity, and that's become sort of like old news in a way. And so the most of the like we find that kind of like not sufficient is that the approach to increasing diversity right now, and I said this is the part of like the broader thing about increasing of decolonizing the discipline and curriculum in particular, is that like it's mostly based through assuming that the problem is individual biases, that basically the people who are in the discipline like individually have biases of like racism, sexism, casteism, etc., and that's what's holding us back. And it doesn't really identify like, in addition to that, it doesn't identify like the theoretical limitations of explaining its own lack of diversity. And part of that is to do with the theoretical sort of monism that we have, that there's only sort of one approach to thinking of discrimination and exclusion in economics. And let's like talk about it for a very brief second, is that the main theories of why discrimination or structural exclusion persists in economics, the explanations that economics provides are pretty much can be, and again, I'm simplifying, but I challenge you to come up with a theoretical explanation that does not fit into these like basically broad categories. The oldest one goes back to like Gary Becker, which is what like, oh, people are just individually racist or sexist or casteist or whatever. And that's sort of like the problem. And, ideally that should have gone away with like greater market forces should have taken care of that. Well, they don't. We can see that has not happened. And then the other sort of approach is sort of statistical discrimination, that we just, that we see there's a statistically like higher likelihood of, say, a certain group of people like being, I don't know, persecuted or committing certain crimes. So like the rational response to seeing that behavior in the world or seeing that statistical fact in the world is to assume that that's actually coming from a place of like sort of criminality or whatever. Like I'm shuddering by even saying these words because that sounds ridiculous. Like that's a ridiculous explanation of discrimination. I'm sorry, I'm being very blunt here. But either way, like the idea is that greater market forces or greater information about these groups would sort of make the problem disappear. And if that is like our approach to studying discrimination in general, like a theoretical, like the mechanism that explains discrimination, how can we, if as economists, like put that same lens onto like within our own discipline and come up with a different explanation? So that's kind of part of the problem, that it's only about like mentoring. If you do more mentoring, if you deal with the existing biases, we'll be rid of this problem. And that's not true. And so what we're basically talking about, which is very important, is that these two things are like absolutely 100% interrelated, and you cannot do one without the other. And so here the role of pluralism in economics is very crucial. And approaches such as like feminist economics, stratification economics, critical race theory, IPE, etc., are extremely important because they center the role of power. And we'll come back to this question really quickly as well. Now, in addition to this, like in addition to the diversity question, it's very important to realize, like I didn't get a nice like sort of oval circle because I would have just, because a lot of all of these things are interrelated. Theoretical and methodological pluralism is important, but in addition to that, like that's not enough, because if most of our theoretical and methodological approaches, and I classify them into some mainstream and heterodox, they're both characterized by sort of, to a certain degree, universalism in economic theory, and also sometimes like blind to structural exclusion within the discipline. And so these problems are interrelated, and therefore we have to tackle them together, which is again a lot to do. So let's see how to think about it. Okay, so this was sort of, I want to frame this discussion kind of, at least what I'm going to say for the next 8 minutes, about this really popular article Danny Roderick wrote back in August. A lot of people really loved it. A lot of people really shared it, which is great. He's pointing out like, and I'm very glad that he uses the word diversity here. But what he, in his article, and you can read it, it's like, it's all over, it's in Project Syndicate. In this article, he's basically arguing that economics has a diversity problem, not only in terms of like race and gender. I would also add in terms of caste, which is not talked about in the global stage because, yeah, it makes sense because it doesn't make sense, but still they don't talk about it as much. That there is a problem of like geographical lack of diversity in that, and that creates like a problem for economics, because basically voices outside of the US, UK, Western Europe are kind of marginalized, and all of that is true. And his whole point is that like, unless we address that, we're sort of missing out on like key insights, and it affects like what we produce as knowledge. And again, that's not incorrect. And sort of what he points out is that there's like massive Eurocentrism in the economics discipline, which manifests itself in like, so in like, these are a few studies that show this. which like the focus of economics. And the reason this is important is because a lot of this filters down into the curriculum. A lot of the research that is produced is basically that eventually, not all of it, a lot of it becomes part of our curriculum and what we learn and what we teach. And so this is like sort of a map of the topic of certain papers that are published in top 5 economics journals, which again, a lot of us are meant to read parts of it as we're learning economics. And you can see that the focus of like most of it is in the United States, is in sort of not even like Western Europe in general, like a lot more just in the UK, and then to a lesser extent in Western Europe, and some of it in like Latin America, but like Australia, of course. But largely, the large part of the world which is inhabited by most people doesn't really feature very much. Like it's not very discussed very much in the top 5 economic journals. And this, like the authors account for availability of data, and still they find like a huge disparity. And you can see the numbers here are pretty stark over here, that, you know, basically between 0 and 1 paper about like all these countries feature in these journals. In addition to that, you can see there's also like concentration of geographical, like editorial power. Basically, like the editors of these journals are basically located within a few centers in the United States or in like Western Europe once again. And so they find that like in number of editorial roles in 49 leading journals are basically, you know, they examine these and they find 63% of like editorial powers in the US, which is again an outrageous inequality. Similarly, like this talking about like citation, like politics and citation, in the sense that 90% of authors in top 8 economics journals are based in the United States. 90%, that's a huge number. And papers from Europe and the rest of the world are sort of like, sorry, I'm trying to move around the Zoom things to read my own slides and it's clicking everything. Anyway, most people cite the papers by authors based in the United States. So, and again, these are like all other ways in which it manifests itself. So I'm not going to go through them. You can take a quick look. And this is all well and good. Okay, like this is very important. But like this is very good. This is very important that we're talking about this now. This is like we're just starting to talk about it in 2021. At least the mainstream of the discipline is. So that's a bit sad, but still at least we're talking about it now. And this matters. Like it's not just a question of, you know, fairness and like justice, which should matter to us anyway. But sometimes it's not important enough. But beyond discrimination being unfair, it affects like quality. Unless like we're considering the vast majority, if we're excluding the vast majority of people from the discipline in a variety of ways, or if we are excluding different ways of thinking or different approaches, we're basically trying to sort of gatekeep our way out of talking about and being confronted with like important scientific contributions, and therefore it's affecting like the quality of economics knowledge. And in addition, there are several studies to show that marginalized groups are more likely to bring viewpoints and would otherwise be absent or undervalued. I mean, the famous example is about like feminist economics, how it started, like, and most of the key initial contributors of the discipline of feminist economics happen to be women, which again, I'm not saying that only they can bring those outside perspectives, but they're more likely to, because that's kind of the, you know, lived experience, etc. And again, this can be talked about like in terms of like race or in terms of caste or in terms of like nationality, etc. Heterodox economics is a better starting point, as you can see from this graph here, which is from a study by Ingrid and Surbi Kesar, who you might be familiar with, which shows that in general, like mainstream economists are less likely to teach and talk about race in their courses. Okay, but it's and this is not enough. And here's where I take issue with Danny Roderick's article, is because again, even when they're talking about like geographical diversity, they only talk about it in terms of like how it serves the mainstream like monolith Eurocentric structure. The reason is because he says the social sciences are enriched when received wisdom is confronted with anomalous behavior or outcomes in unfamiliar environments, when the diversity of local circumstances is fully considered. And yeah, that's true, but I'm sorry, like that's not the only reason why we should be talking about like or shifting our lens to a different point of view, because we're not necessarily the rest of the world is not anomalous behavior. We can't assume that sort of the basic thing that happens, everything that happens in the US or Western Europe is the norm, and everything else is just like something else that happens. It's it's very important to start from a different starting point, because otherwise we're always like looking at the most of the world from a different, from like, oh, this is just an aberration, and still like starting from the same theories, the same universalism. And that's just, you know, a waste of our time, and it's ineffective in producing like the knowledge that we would like to produce, right? And so, which brings us back to what do we mean by decolonizing economics? So part of it is like we're trying, well, some of us are writing a book, so hopefully by that time we will have a definition pinned down. But while we're doing that, it's like, it's important to say that it's not just a question of diversity, which is a worthy goal in itself. Decolonizing economics is a much larger question of challenging the knowledge, challenging the way knowledge in economics is produced, including what counts as economics, who counts as an economist, and where economics knowledge is housed or created. And it's ultimately a question of recognizing venues of power within economics and working to dismantle them. Okay, so I'm running out of time, so I just have one more thing. So when I say all this, does it necessarily mean, like, if we're talking from like an India perspective, or we're talking from a specific like global South country perspective, does that decolonizing economic curriculum entail a furthering a kind of like economic nationalism? Does this mean for like students or researchers in India that, oh, we need to basically like focus on Indian researchers or like other global South researchers in a way that is sort of like, that's kind of where we go. And I think one, to an extent, yes, but to a larger extent, no. Because as I say, it's about sort of centering the role of power structures within our discipline and within the knowledge we produce. Therefore, it also entails like turning a critical lens onto our own sort of like national sense of like, when we're talking about like furthering sort of the work by Indian researchers, it would also mean, okay, but what is their theoretical standpoint? Are they actually centering power in what they do and say? Are they using a pluralist approach? What is within sort of Indian academia, the question would also, again, we would have to ask and seriously examine, like, why is it that Indian academia is dominated by mostly like upper caste men from the cities, rather than sort of a wider set of people who are still excluded from the discipline, not only at the level of sort of like you know, professorial jobs, but also in the student body. And so that's also a question to ask. So it's not so much like a case of uncritical furthering of just like scholars from India or scholars from the global South, but also sort of like challenging the conditions in which they're produced, and also necessarily like critically examining what they're producing. So it's a far more like complicated story, and I know it's really hard, and I've said a lot of like contradictory things, but hopefully like going forward we can discuss it further. So anyway, I'm gonna stop here. I hope that was some amount of a cohesive story here, but yeah, because we're gonna go on to a more interactive part of our session from here. So Alex, do you want to take over?
Yeah, so now what we want to, thank you so much, Delegate, so much information. I feel like I'm learning every time I see you present. What we're going to do now is we're going to go into breakout rooms, where we're basically going to have like a smaller group, and we have a couple of questions where we want to get your input on. So I think we are going to start our breakout rooms. Just bear with us a second. I also know that we had a question in the chat. It was a very good question about how we as D-Econ define mainstream economics, and we shared a link there, Paul shared a link there to one of our blog posts that I think really highlights how we're looking at this concept. So we are just going to start our breakout rooms, and just click the join button.
Everyone else who is here as an attendee, we request you to please join your designated breakout rooms that will help you understand and relate and interact with the discussion more. Palak, you should have gotten, you're in room 3. You should have gotten a notification to just click join. You are in room 3 with Paul.
Palak, you would have received the notification on your screen. Hello, Mira, can you hear me? Hello? The method of a breakout room actually. So if you would like to stay put here, there's already an ongoing discussion in so I would suggest that you join the next breakout room, which will happen about 5%.
So I'm just going to wait for the other rooms to join, and that's why I'm sitting quiet.
Is everyone back?
My group is back.
Yeah, so is mine. So sorry, just to move things along. So that was a great discussion, and you can take me off of the pin pretty soon. But I think we're going to move on to like talk about concrete examples of how what we mean when we're talking about like decolonizing economics, and basically we're going to talk about stuff that relates to our respective areas of research or interests. And so I think we're going to start with Alex, right? Alex, we're going to start with you. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Absolutely. No, you're right. You're absolutely right. But before we do that, we're just going to do a sort of short summary on what we were talking about in the different rooms. So I guess I'm going to start because I'm currently talking. So we had a really good discussion in our room. We had a good group of different approaches. So we had one university lecturer. We had one someone who's actively working in the finance sector, and we had one PhD student. And we were sort of discussing how there are currently issues where we're teaching economic theory that is very much looking at equilibriums, but that doesn't actually explain the reality that a lot of students and people acting within the economy is experiencing today, especially within the rural areas. And we're also talking about how there is a lack of appropriate methods being taught early on, which results in that we have inaccurate both micro and macro approaches that don't help us predict the changes that big external events like COVID or even the financial crisis 2008 has. So suggestions were to bring in both alternative heterodox approaches to help criticality, but also these tools that we have as economists to teach them a lot earlier on. So criticality together with empirical tools can actually help create more applicable reality explaining economists out there. So it was a really good discussion. Should we start? Ingrid, do you want to go next?
Yeah, sure. That sounds, yeah, really interesting. And we also had a very rich discussion, and also very diverse group, like kind of like yours, but with someone from undergraduate economics student in India, and then a master's student in economics in Brazil, and sociology. Someone from sociology as well. So which meant that the problems of decolonizing were different for each person, which kind of related to what Devika was saying earlier about like the different ways of like understanding decolonizing depending on what your challenges, the challenges that you face. So in like the case of D-Econ was saying, like in India, like they're using Mankiw to study economics, which is, totally the American context, missing any, Indian context and examples that are relatable at all. So at that, the problem then is basically you need pluralism. It's like I was bringing up Alex Thomas's new book as a possible solution to that. Whereas João in Brazil, there is actually pluralism, in a lot of Brazilian institutions and in the institution where he's studying. But even though there's pluralism, there's still lots of problems like economics can't deal with like racism, for example. So there's not like anti-racist scholarship or anti-colonial scholarship. So that is like was the major challenge there. And for Ritika, who's coming from sociology, was like, well, she basically, this is what happens to a lot of people, right? They take economics and it's like, oh, it's completely removed from reality. Let me just move to another discipline. She was saying like, because of the economics not really looking at subjective things like well-being, like everything's presented as objective and only like economic indicators. So that was like the problem for her that economics needs to address. And then we talked quite a bit about these problems, and then we moved to try to talk about how we can, like what needs to change and how we can change it. And some things that came up were like talking to people from different backgrounds just to kind of challenge our own understanding of what's going on. challenge our own way of thinking, reassess what we mean by all these kind of things that we take for granted, like progress and development. Think about like indigenous knowledge, how to include like indigenous ways of living in the way that we understand the economy. And like very concrete things like speaking, whenever someone says something offensive, always speak up, that's like concrete things that we can do. Yeah, that was kind of a short summary. And then I'll pass the baton on to Paul.
Hey, yeah, also had a really great, interesting discussion with people from Rethinking India and Rethinking Spain in Barcelona. And there's a lot of overlap with what has been mentioned before about this kind of relationship with other disciplines. And this question of criticality that Alexandra was talking about, Jai was talking about, coming into economics, not realizing that there's such a thing as a colonized discipline, even having, if you want to decolonize economics, then professors need to be telling first year students what it means to decolonize economics and what it means to be teaching colonized economics, right? But also we can't assume that all professors want to decolonize, right? Even, people teach Manchu in India, which we also talked about for a reason. And so there's a lot of work to be done to push against that, because it's not just Western, it's not just American, it's a very particular way of understanding class and inequality that doesn't necessarily have to be geographically located, right? As much as we did talk about, several people talked about the need to include contextual examples, local examples. And then we also had this discussion about, I guess we're all here, and not just wanting to throw economics in the bin, but assuming that there is something that can be rescued from this. And Samriddhi was talking about the sort of value of pluralism again, and this idea that you have Western templates for economics being used to chart courses to growth and development around the world with all the problems that brings, except many Western economies and societies are failing on so many measures of development, including and beyond growth, right? So there's a sort of Western centrism and a Western failure at the heart of this. So you need some kind of pluralism in order to, and some kind of, I think she used this idea, portfolio of ideas to kind of put this knowledge to use in bettering lives in society, right? And the final thing that I think is worth mentioning is a point was made about how up until the 90s, you would have found a lot of Indian economists in Indian textbooks. So whether there's the kind of recolonization around liberalization, around the time, globally of structural adjustment programs and so on, that when we talk about the colonizing, economics as a colonized discipline is not necessarily referring to the kind of period of Viraj or pre-independence colonization, but an intellectual colonization or institutional colonization that may have come later, which means we need different tactics. So
that sounds very interesting, but very quickly so that we don't run out of time. For a moment, I was confused about the number of people in my group, so didn't start the discussion for a second. But anyway, so in our, like a lot of this similar stuff, it was mostly people who are still students of economics or recent graduates of economics, but a lot of the frustration with what you guys shared, so I'm not going to repeat it, about like same textbooks being used, examples that are being from like the Bureau of Labor Statistics in the United States, completely irrelevant to the Indian context, and yeah, like the frustration with like viewing things such as labor in India from a very like, that economisty Western lens, and sort of excluding discussions about like bonded labor or other kinds of sustainability, and which are completely absent from the discussion, which was something which was very important. And of course, like whether you could stay in economics to study something like that, or you have to leave the discipline, as you said, like because there are people who are from other disciplines here, which is great. So those are the focus of the discussions. I'm not going to repeat the things that were in you guys mentioned, just for the sake of time. But yeah, very interesting group, and also very excited that folks are really motivated. And it gives me a lot of hope that we're not sort of like screaming into the ether, just us. But yeah, definitely very motivated. But yeah, I'll sort of like stop so that we can move on to the next part.
Cool. That's some really good discussion that has happened. what we're going to do now is we talked a bit about the problems. So what can we do? And we are going to talk a little bit about the role of decolonization within economics teaching. And we're going to give first 2 examples from me and Ingrid. And then we're going to have a little bit of a longer discussion with Paul to sort of round up this session. I'm going to start sharing my screen. Can you see it? Perfect. So a lot of the things that we heard now in the discussion and a sort of common critique of neoclassical economics is that it ignores economics' systematic reinforcement of inequality, how the economic system reinforces a carbon emission-based production system, and that it is ahistoric. As part of this, so I'm an environmental economist, and when we're teaching the relationship between economics and the environment, we're not really acknowledging that economics is, is part of society which lives within the environment. Rather, we're teaching environmental economics as a module, a sub area of economics. We're treating the planet's destruction as an externality, something that we can look at with a diagram. And we're all overall sort of separating the economy and the environment. It's especially interesting now when we're in the middle of sort of the making of history with being in the COVID pandemic. And the COVID pandemic has sort of stressed that we have these large inequalities and socioeconomic inequalities, both within countries and between countries. So we need the current economic that we're teaching, the current economic curriculum is fairly unequipped to analyze how did we end up here. And we need better tools to start to sort of dig out these problems. So an example of how we can do this is when we're looking at how we decarbonize and decolonize the economics curriculum and why these have to go hand in hand. So I'm going to try to change my screen. So climate change. We all know that climate change is happening. We all agree that we have a problem with the current curriculum. And these two are related because climate change is a social justice issue. The consequences of climate crisis isn't distributed equally, and we can't really begin to understand the origins of the climate emergency without also understanding the history of colonialism. So I've taken and sort of copied this quote from some of the recent work on this. And what do I mean that decarbonization and decolonization are linked? When we're starting to think about our carbon emission-based economy, it started with the industrialization. And the industrialization is linked to colonialism in that we had our current developed countries, which were going to other countries, utilizing their natural resources, bringing it back home, which is powered on the industrialization causing the start of the climate crisis as we see it today. So industrialization caused the climate crisis were related to the colonial era. This has ongoing effect in that we have extracted resources from countries, the countries that are generally experiencing the hardest part of the climate crisis, but they are left without these natural resources that are often needed to strengthen their own economy, adapting to climate change and starting to move and change the economy and becoming resilient. So they are left without these resources caused by a problem that they haven't caused themselves. At the same time, we are looking at are economies that are, or developed economies are, I'm saying because I'm Swedish, and Sweden is known as being great climate-wise because we have a lot of electric cars. But how are these electric cars created? They are created by buying cheap natural resources from developing nations that they are selling fairly cheap because it's raw material that's then being developed into technology that is making us being able to be a carbon neutral economy. So there's a strong link between the system, the economic system, the carbon economy, and colonialism. All right, so what do we do about this? To understand these relationships that I babbled about a little bit now, we need to understand the interconnection between different parts of an economy and how the systems that we are experiencing today are strengthening and reinforcing these issues. And two great approaches which sort of alternative heterodox economists are using are intersectionality and system thinking. So really strong tools where intersectionality illustrate that all of forms of oppressions are linked. We're not just having sort of gender, race, class as separate issues, but all of these comes together, and that also acts within the sort of macroeconomy. At the same time, we can use systems thinking to understand why we need to have changes, not just in one separate field, but how they have to act at the same time in multiple areas. So I'm not going to go in too much into these at once. I just want to say, so what can we do? You guys had some great discussions going on. So I'm just going to say what the research suggests. But generally within the field I'm looking at the moment, so decolonisation, we need to start to acknowledge the role of colonialism in climate policy and climate action. We need to start improving the lack of information. A main reason why we're not giving climate funding to a lot of nations today is a lack of data. That data is systematically missing from all these countries, and then we're systematically not giving them funding. We need to stop prioritizing only technology over things like social infrastructure and social well-being. Stop allowing carbon neutral consumption at the expense of social and ecological costs in other nations, and address the climate crisis, drawing upon expertise, not just of the ones that are currently relating back to what Devika said, not just about the sort of current elite, but of the people most affected. So I'm going to stop there. I could speak about this for ages, but I'm going to hand over to Ingrid.
Yeah, I can go now, but I wonder if it's worth taking any questions, if people have any.
Yeah, please. So if you have questions, you can write them in the chat, and I can answer them as we go along. Or if anyone wants to ask a question, you know, with your voice, feel free to unmute yourself and ask.
Yeah, cool. Awesome. Okay, so thank you so much, Alex. That was really, really interesting and important. And something I think a lot of people don't think about when they think about decolonization, like the role of climate. I will talk about development economics as a field, as a subfield, and how we can, like, one way of thinking about that field and the problems with it and what we can do about it. So let me see, I'll just share my screen. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah, okay. Okay, so decolonizing the curriculum. What about development economics? So, I mean, I think the problem with development economics is similar to a lot of the problems that were already talked about, but they might be even maybe more severe than in other fields, or like even more colonial. So have a think about how development economics is taught in your experience. I don't know if You know, all of you haven't probably taken development economics courses, but some of you have. So have a, yeah, I guess we don't have time for like a big brainstorm, but just have a little think. And then I'll talk about how it's come to be taught sort of generally in a lot of parts of the world, although of course not everywhere. Some places still have more anti-colonial ways of teaching development economics. But just so very quickly, the big question in development, or one of the big questions, is like, why is there this massive inequality between countries? Why are, you know, are some, well, in the mainstream they would say, you know, why are some countries lagging behind? Why aren't they catching up? Is there this gap? And in like the development economics, or in the economics generally literature, there's so many different explanations for this, right? This is the whole, as many of you know, of course, there's like plurality of theories, which is what rethinking economics is always highlighting. And of course, that's the same in development economics. You can, yeah, what are the reasons? Well, you can, you know, point to colonialism and imperialism. You can point to, you know, there's modernization theory, which also has its explanations for inequality. You could look at polarizing tendencies of capitalism in like Marxist literature or in dependency theory. You could look at anti-colonial scholarship or post-colonial scholarship. You can look, there's like a whole structuralist literature on, you know, the problems of structural transformation in the periphery or in the global south. You could look at how markets are structured and think of like market explanations for these inequalities. Or you could look at like developmental state and use that as like an explanatory factor for why some countries managed to develop and some didn't. Or you could look at institutions, good governance. There's so many different explanations that are out there in the literature that you could teach, that you can learn, that you can like discuss. But in the economics, like in the mainstream of the field, basically what tends to happen is that many of these explanations are excluded from the curriculum. So I just put some examples of the ones that are excluded here in red. So those are basically not taught in the mainstream literature, in the mainstream curriculum. And then you're left with modernization, which is often kind of implicit in a lot of the way that we teach development economics. You're left with market explanations, which is you know, still very, very important in the development economics field. You have behavioral, individualistic explanations, institutions, and good governance, and then all these other things are just kind of left out, not talked about, moved to other disciplines like sociology and politics and whatever. So that's basically, yeah, just an illustration of what you lose when you have a very monolithic discipline. So the result of that, I would argue, is like a very narrow way of understanding development economics. And incidentally, it's also presented as apolitical. So it's not presented as like, oh, we chose to only focus on markets and, you know, good governance, corruption and behavior. It's presented as, this is what development economics is. You know, this is what we need to study to understand how developing countries can develop, you know. So it's presented as something that's not political, it's just empirical, this is the reality, which means there isn't room to study these other highly relevant questions like, you know, what is the role of a developmental state? You know, what is unequal exchange? You know, what drives it? What is, you know, structural transformation? What about colonial drain? Completely out of the question. You know, it's not even something that you can bring up, like an economist, if you bring it up, that seems like it's not really relevant for development economics as a field anymore, because it's become this methods-driven science, right? Which, like, this big, I guess, illustration of that is the Nobel Prize that went to the randomistas that I put on the slide here, which basically for pioneering a method, randomized control trials, which is basically just, you know, you go and do experiments in the global south, abstracted from like history, context, politics. You just say like, this is the intervention. Did it work? Did it not work? How did it work? You know, how does it need to be tweaked? And it's often like behavioral interventions, right? So it's something that is presented as something empirical. So another consequence of that is that these solutions are small. You don't look at the, you know, global system, the global economy, and they're used. I mean, it's presented as apolitical, but at the same time, it's used in politics and it's one of the justifications for doing these experiments is to inform policy. So in a way, it's presented as apolitical, but at the same time, highly political. Even though it's presented as like, oh, this is just evidence so that governments can pursue better policies. So then, so debate is narrowed, and economists themselves are ignorant about these rich debates. So in a way, it constrains economists themselves. And as one of the randomistas, famously said in a speech at one point, Esther Duflo was like that, oh, us as economists, we're like plumbers. We go in and we like fix things. So basically, like that's basically what development economics to some extent has been reduced to because of this abstraction from these big political debates that exist in the field as a whole, if you include heterodox economics, but obviously that they don't really exist anymore in the mainstream. And that's just to say that that's kind of at the micro level, but also at the macro level, you have the same kind of narrowing with market-based solutions being like the main the main way of thinking about development. And you see this, for example, with Danny Roderick that Devika mentioned in the introduction, who is kind of an illustration of a kind of radical within the mainstream, right? And so you see how far a radical person in the mainstream can go. So, he's for like government regulation of markets, but the solutions are always thought of like within markets. And he, like in his initiative that he launched a few years ago, Economics for Inclusive Prosperity, he does talk about how basically neoclassical economics isn't the problem. We need to like develop neoclassical economics and improve neoclassical economics so that it can better help us solve, the problems in the world. So he's not like for pluralism at all. He's for like improving neoclassical economics. So that is sort of a very brief overview of development economics. And I think what we can do about it is some of the things that we already talked about, like, introduce more theories. Introduce also, I think, decolonial theories, and introduce colonialism as an issue, extremely important issue when you think about like development problems. And I just added this point while listening to Alex about capturing systems and intersectionalities. That is something that is completely lost when you look at only like markets or individuals as like the way of thinking about society. And then I would say actually also repoliticize development economics. It isn't apolitical field. It's a very political field, and it's like a political choice to choose to look at individuals rather than like a system or a structure. So pointing out that it is, actually a political choice is something that another thing that we can do to challenge the mainstream. So I'll stop there and take any questions if there are any, or any like additional comments about development economics as a field and how to challenge it. Or you can put them in the chat if you have any thoughts. And then I'll pass on to...
I think we have a question. Sorry, it's in my way because I can't see. We had a question. Do you just want to ask your question?
Can you, oh, I don't think you're, wait, hold on. Go ahead. Go.
Oh. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. I just wanted to ask maybe if we already know what kind of ideology is behind development, and if you already know that development is also a pretext and an excuse for also understanding colonization, even today within international institutions, that we really should focus on that term, if that should be indeed the question, or maybe a decolonization of economics would also entail a detachment from the idea of development. Maybe like, I know it's a big question, but maybe some thoughts on it. I think it would be very interesting in that context. Thank you.
Yeah, it's a super good point. So basically, yeah, the ideology of development itself, right? Which I didn't even touch on in this presentation, but that's a really good point. And I think a little bit I think it was Ritika who brought it up in the group discussion about like challenging, yeah, development as a concept. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. I can't see any other hands.
I had a question. I'm Jaya. Somewhere between a question and a comment, not sure, but I think it's in between what you presented and what Alexandra presented on the apolitical part of things. Because so I work a little bit in climate, and what I see happening in some places is that they are treating like the development economics part of climate economics. So where they're treating the decolonization part of climate as apolitical. So again, even though they're saying that, yes, developing countries probably get affected differently, and maybe there should be something different that should be done, but then unfortunately, we sort of get bounded in the same problems, not really solving it at the end of the day. So I don't know, like it was just a thought that how sort of there's probably a layer within climate on development, which again ends up becoming apolitical. So I don't know, any thoughts on maybe how that can be solved, or if there are always layers in between different schools of thought that end up sort of getting caught in this vicious cycle?
I can make a quick comment on that. So one of the problems absolutely within climate is, so when we're looking for actions and solutions, one of the big problems is lack of data. So people want data that is standardized all over the world, but the problem isn't standardized. So one of I think the solutions, what people are asking before within sort of the decolonize, decarbonize, is to starting to acknowledge that taking firstly like people's, sorry for my dog, starting to take people's, how do you say, anecdotal evidence as an evidence, and starting to fund a project without needing 10 years of carbon data, for example. Not carbon data is available, and engaging with local communities rather than on just sort of national basis. I'm not sure if that helped, but I agree with absolutely what you're saying. And do you want to say anything about this, Ingrid?
I can add something very quickly before I pass it on to Paul. I know we're kind of running out of time, but I just think it's such a good comment, because it does exactly looks at this where development, econ, and environment overlap, and it's just like mind-blowing that like environmental problems in developing countries obviously like were severely like worsened during colonialism, that was like extremely extractive and like structured these countries in like extremely like problematic ways, environmentally and economically and politically and socially. And then, people come in and, propose certain like technical fixes to help mitigate climate change. It's like an extremely political act to not address those, problems that stem from colonialism, at least, back to the colonial period. So I think like, yeah, repoliticizing and like exposing how political that is, to only look at, these like interventions, blueprints that come from the global north to, build some windmills or whatever, is like, it looks like it's framed as it's something good, but then it's because it's abstracted from like the terrible history. So yeah, just wanted to add that. Yeah, so I'll pass it on to Paul. I have about 10 minutes left.
Cool, thanks everyone. I will be quick. I'm going to try to share my screen and do my best not to get it wrong. So let's hope. Can you still see that PowerPoint? Yeah, sorry, I've got two screens, so it sometimes goes a bit funny. So I want to just talk quickly to try and pick up on some of the questions that people gave in response to Alexandra's poll and the breakout rooms, and maybe point towards some other ways in which we could take this, keep thinking about this, keep this discussion going. So probably it's kind of biased as well to something that I've been thinking about recently, and so obviously comes from the UK context in which I work. So the question that I want to try and talk about for just a couple of minutes is, you know, what should we do with the theory, the ideas that we inherit, right, in this colonized discipline? So a lot of the answers to Alexandra's poll were about economics being too Western, too American-centric, too Eurocentric. And we talked about this in the breakout rooms. So then what do we do, right? Do we get rid of it? Do we talk back to the kind of influence of American, European economists? Do we completely change this? And then this also raises questions about, you know, is this a problem in the West as much as it is elsewhere, right? And why? Clearly, we all think, because most of us are based in sort of global North / Western institutions, that the economics that we teach and learn here should be decolonized as well, should be otherwise. We shouldn't just, you know, be okay with the Western inheritance in the West, right? Because a lot of people in the breakout rooms are talking about the need to contextualize or localize economic examples. And that is important, but in a way that doesn't quite go far enough, right? Because does that mean in the West it's okay to use ManQ because it's a Western example, right? Most of us here, I think, would say no, under no circumstances. So, so we need to recontextualize economics in the West as well, right? And how do we do that? And speaking to all the comments from all the rethinking people about pluralism, what are we going to do about these other disciplinary perspectives? How do we get them in? And this is something that, like, I think about a lot being a teacher in university, because it sort of is where the grand aspirations of decolonizing run up against the like really banal politics of organizing a degree program and sharing courses between departments and stuff, which is part of this struggle, right? So I want to talk a bit about the imperial Keynes, and I've chosen Keynes to talk about because of obviously his long engagement with India, to the India office, and because he used to live down the road from my university in Lewis. And he's often associated with, at least in the UK, with this kind of broadly social democratic, maybe some would say left liberal perspective, managing national economies in crisis for collective welfare. People roll out Keynes every time there's some kind of crisis. And he's also, you know, we were just talking the last session about the technical fix, the wise expert with their intervention. He's sort of the prototype of this, right? So huge mark on economics. And yet his ideas were developed in the context of this really firm commitment to the British Empire. Okay, so we know from Indian scholars like Uttar Patnaik that Keynes explicitly applied different standards to India and the UK, right? When he was managing these economies in crisis for their collective welfare. You know, in the UK during wartime, he thought about, you know, demand management, raising employment and incomes. And in some of his early writings, he said, well, there is another way you can do this. You could cut mass incomes, divert money to profits by inflating prices, and then, you know, it'll be easier to tax the profits of the industrialists. Obviously, it will hammer the normal people, their consumption will be massively impacted. He wrote about how this would clearly be not acceptable in the UK, but he advocated it in India, right, where there was a huge consumption impact. So clearly double standards in this application. And Callum Biltoft, the historian, looks at Keynes's sort of imperial values and commitments and how they were built up through his relationship with ideas and literature around the time. So, you know, it's not the usual thing you'd maybe get on an economics reading list, because it's all about how the metaphor of giraffes was used in Keynes and evolutionary biologists and colonial writers, right? And this creates a disciplinary problem. How do you get that onto an economics degree? But she also looks at how when you take Keynes's writings from the 20s, where he was clear about Britain's economic dependence on empire, that kind of disappeared from reprints in the 30s, where now he's just talking about, you know, spending to protect collective welfare, and we don't know whose collective welfare. And it's the assumption is the generic national collective welfare, except he was originally talking about British welfare at the cost of Indian welfare, if necessary, right? So this has been erased from a lot of how we receive Keynes as the technical intervention expert, right? The wise intervener. And we can go further looking at Keynes's relationship to India and empire. And Manu Goswami has written about how Keynes's ideas were actually shaped by encounters with Indian nationalist economists, people writing about the drain, I think Ingrid mentioned, so Dutt, Naroji, people like that. And he was very dismissive of them. He wrote against them. He was originally very committed to free trade, right? Not an interventionist. And Goswami argues, you know, it's hard to prove, but there's enough traces in the text to suggest that Keynes's embrace of this sort of demand management, of managing the national economy for collective welfare, was sort of something he saw in the Indian nationalist economists and then turned it around to protect the metropolitan, the colonizers' national economy, right? Which means that what we inherit as Keynesian economics is fundamentally shaped by Indian nationalist economists, right? So this means that maybe it's not so Western after all, and that's not necessarily a problem, but it means that we might need to think about our language, think about orientation. You know, we can ask, what does this mean for how we should teach Keynes? Do we have to teach about his broader ideas, teach him in context to understand him? You know, for me, I think the answer is yes, because it's part of a kind of social history in which the welfare of, say, members of the British economy is intimately entangled with the welfare of those in the colonies, India and elsewhere. Some broadly mainstream people might say, no, you can abstract out the technical, right? But then that also leaves us with this issue of the idea that there's a Western economics that needs to be decolonized is sort of only half the story, right? And Julian McClure, drawing on the work of Gominda Bambra, one of my colleagues here at Sussex, talks about connected intellectual history, connected sociologies of economic thought, you could say, right? There is no Western tradition from the West, because most of what we call the Western tradition is built through dialogue with the colonized world, but the colonized world is written out of that, right? So maybe a lot of what decolonizing has to be is not just recontextualizing, adding local content, but for those of us in the former kind of colonial heartlands, as well as people in former colonized territories, is thinking about economics as co-produced and thinking about what is made silent and why, and how economics serves power, and how we can unpick that both here and in the global South, right? So, you know, that's one, I guess, suggestion for how we could think about these issues around contextualization, around challenging the Westernness of economics in a way that's probably harder to work with, but maybe gives us more seeds of connections to follow, to unpick, to find where there are silences and make them visible, instead of pitting this idea of a closed West against a rest. I will stop sharing. Does anyone have any responses, challenges, questions?
I think we're running out of time. So
okay, sorry.
I think that such an interesting sort of sum up of what we've been talking about. Oh yeah. Do you wanna make a comment to this? I'll mute myself.
Yeah, I just wanted to basically show some information about Decon, because all of the, I mean, it's been a really great session, and it's been so interesting to hear some of your guys' thoughts. I haven't been able to talk to all of you, of course, but among ourselves, we were able to talk to all of you. And it would be great to keep in touch. And if you want to join Decon, it's like a relatively, it's an open network. Anyone, like we have a bunch of different working groups. There's a curriculum working group where we like talk about how to basically reform the curriculum and come up with, we're trying to come up with guidelines, questions to think about, things like that. And there's also lots of other working groups that are working on different things. So you could join on the blog or a database or languages, practices in general. Yeah. So just here's the website, here's the Twitter, here's the Facebook. And you can also feel free to reach out to any of us if you're interested in that. Yeah, so basically that was what I wanted to say with this slide. Join us, basically. It'll be great to have your input on this.
Is it worth popping our individual email addresses in the chat if people are okay with that, in case someone has a question about a particular section or presentation? Then
Great idea.
Sure.
Let's do that.
Yep, please go ahead. Yes.
So just very quickly, and like we timed it such that unfortunately we were hoping that we would have more conversation during a presentation, then it's totally fine if we didn't. But yeah, feel free to reach out to us for questions or whatever at any time through any of the forums that we mentioned. We're more than happy to discuss this. Like we live and breathe this for way too much, honestly, of our time. So yeah, we're happy to talk about it at greater length if anybody would like. And I guess like maybe I can leave with one parting message because we're out of time, so we won't take on much longer. And feel free anyone else to chime in if you want to, but I was really encouraged to see that there's like still so much fire among so many like students still to think about this in a broader way. Sometimes like when you're sort of staring into the belly of the beast, it feels pretty bleak sometimes. And so it was like, it's sort of really encouraging for all of us. So yeah, we would really love to sort of channel that energy through like what we're doing in D-Econ further. But in addition, like this is something like now I recently reread this piece by Tim Mitchell, who is not an economist, he's a political scientist, I believe, about like how economics makes its world. And I recommend anybody to read it. It's really fun. It's not a very long article. It's very easy to read. I'm happy to share it if people are interested in reading it. And so like what I'm trying to say is that like everything that you said in the breakout rooms and have questions about, and like I just want to leave with a message of hope that like a lot of what you say is something that we can actually like make happen because economics is an extremely powerful discipline, and it's up to us to sort of channel it in a way that is useful and productive and towards making a better world. And don't think that just because it's an activist or whatever like bent of mind that it's any less valid, because often that is dismissed within a discipline as like being non-serious. But anyway, just wanted to leave with that wording message. So yeah, and I'll share the article with the organizers, so if they want they can share it around, and if that's okay. Yeah. Anybody else? Last thoughts? No. Okay, great. Thanks so much. We had a great time.
I can take over.
Yeah, go ahead. Thanks, Jan.
thank you everyone.
So thank you so much, everyone. Thank you so much, Paul, Alexandra, Ingrid, and Devika for doing this. We have been wanting D-Econ to facilitate a workshop for us for a really long time, and we're glad this is finally happening. And for the audience, we hope you found this session as insightful as we did, and you enjoyed this as much as we did curating it for you, and as much as D-Econ did curating it for you. Thank you again, all for a few for doing this. We learned a lot. And thank you also for sharing your email addresses. I'm sure people would have a lot to say. For the audience, we have our last session, not only for the day, but for our entire annual event of this year. Starting in 1 hour, we would be talking about the evolution of economics education. It's a conversation that is happening between Sanjay Reddy of the New School, who we also know it was Ingrid's supervisor, and with Rahul Dey, who is at the Azim Premji University. So it's a conversation between the two of them. It's going to be really interesting. So do join us. We'll put up the links in the chat. And it's also, like I said, going to be our last session for the our closing session for the annual event. So thank you everyone again for joining, and thank you again for D-Econ for doing this for us.
It was our pleasure. Thanks a lot for having us. Yeah, I hope everyone has a great last session. Sanjay is awesome. So is Rahul Day. So yeah, great. Okay, bye.
Thank you. Bye.